Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection, the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today, along with my colleagues from the Congressional Black Caucus, to talk today to the American people about the tragedy of Port Chicago, California, and the injustice that marked the lives of 50 African-American sailors in 1944 and continues to mark every American today. On my right is an overview of where the facility is. It is still an existing naval facility or a Department of Defense facility, an important deep-water port that allows for munitions to go to strategic assets in the Pacific. This is the map of the Bay Area. You can see it's in the Sacramento Delta as the Delta comes into the San Francisco Bay. The photograph is an aerial photograph, obviously, of how the facility looked in 1944. You can see where the trains came in and put the boxcars into sidings that had concrete on either side to protect people from explosions. And then you can see where the ships docked. In this photograph, there is one ship docked. On the night that we will talk about, there were 2 ships loaded, and in continuously operated shifts, those shifts were loaded, as witnesses would say, in a manner that sacrificed safety in order for expedience. The fateful moonless night on Monday, July 17, 1944, was clear and cool. A slight breeze was blowing from the southwest. 2 cargo ships were tied up at the pier, Port Chicago Pier, under floodlights. Work was proceeding at full speed all hours. Shortly after 10:18 p.m., disaster struck. This is how the day of the explosion is described by Dr. Robert Allen in his book titled The Port Chicago Mutiny. The deadliest homefront disaster of World War II occurred at Port Chicago Naval Magazine, a major ammunitions facility in my district in Northern California. The shipyard site was 2 miles from the little community of Port Chicago, population 1,500, and in those days the greater area was largely wheat fields and had a very small population of under 50,000. The area currently has a population of over 600,000. Indicative of the discriminatory practices at the time, all of the enlisted men loading ammunition at the site were African American, whereas all of their officers were Caucasian. The explosion killed or wounded 710 people, 435 of whom were African American. They had no formal training in safe methods of ammunition or explosives handling given to any of the enlisted men. The Navy failed to adequately provide these enlisted men with the tools necessary to be able to operate under safe working conditions, even after the tragedy struck. When the surviving 258 African-American sailors who understandably refused to return to work in these deplorable conditions following the explosion, 50 were charged with mutiny and convicted. During this time, we seek to bring attention to the systemic racial discrimination suffered by these sailors while on duty in order to bring perspective to the ongoing discrimination against people of color as we enter into the weekend which will note the 71st anniversary of this tragedy. Prior to the explosion, many officers at Port Chicago had no previous training either at experience in ship loading, handling ammunition, or commanding enlisted men. Many of them were reservists. They were called to active duty from civilian life and given little or no training. They had to, as they said, learn by doing. Black enlisted men were also untrained. While they were very aware of the inherent danger of their jobs, these African-American men coped by discounting their risks and much by humor. Weeks before the explosion, the Longshoremen's Union of San Francisco warned the Navy that there would be disaster at Port Chicago if the Navy continued to use untrained seamen to load ammunition. The Longshoremen's Union was doing similar work in other ports on the West Coast and knew how to load these dangerous materials safely and did not sacrifice safety for speed. The Union offered to send experienced longshoremen to train Navy recruits in the safe handling of ammunition, but this offer was ignored by the Navy. This existing policy required the Coast Guard to provide a detail to ensure that safe handling procedures were followed. Navy commanders believed that this was unnecessary and would create confusion and disrupt loading. When the Coast Guard tried to oversee operations, it rejected the Navy's common practice, including the practice of moving bombs by rolling and dropping them into place in the ship's hold. Alternative methods offered by the Coast Guard were considered, quote, ridiculous by the Navy and ignored. In addition, sailors were encouraged to compete against each other to load as much ammunition as possible into the ship, and officers placed nightly bets among themselves as to which division would load more, and then pursued their individual enlisted men to make sure that they would win bets as small as $5. During the environment of this whole period, 8-day work periods were what were allowed by the Navy. You'd have 6 days of loading ammunition with a sleep break and with meals and short rest periods. Then after the 6th day, you would have what was called a duty day, which you'd do duty around the facility, and you'd have 1 day of liberty. This, at that time, was a very remote facility and was a long way from Oakland, the nearest major city, but many of the enlisted men made that trip anyways and went back to work very exhausted. Aside from the petty officers, all the officers at Port Chicago were white. Commanding officers believed black enlisted men were a major problem rather than an asset. Captain Nelson Gose, the commanding officer of Mare Island, of which Port Chicago was a subcommand, said the black recruits, and I quote, arrived with a chip on their shoulder, if not indeed one on each shoulder. In actuality, these recruits joined the military to defend their country and to fight, if necessary, and put themselves in harm's way overseas. Captain Gose also complained that they were poor workers, capable of only 60% of the work compared to white workers. In turn, black men resented, obviously, that only they were assigned to essential labor battalions charged with doing dangerous work. They were distressed that they could not receive the rating and promotions that they thought they deserved. For men working under these precarious conditions, the situation amounted to a new form of slavery. A worker described Port Chicago, quote, as a slave outfit, end quotes, adding that, again in quotes, we were considered a cheap labor force from the beginning, end quotes. They believed their life was worth less. They were treated as if their lives were worth less, just as their work and abilities were valued less. A group of men drafted a letter in 1943 setting their grievances and pointing out that the morale among the enlisted men at Port Chicago had dropped to, and I quote again, an alarming depth. On the evening of the 17th, two ships, as I said, the E.A. Bryan and the Quinhole Victory. The Quinhole Victory was a brand new ship that was about to embark on its maiden voyage, were both in port being loaded. The E.A. Bryan was almost fully loaded as they entered into the graveyard shift. In the enlisted men's barracks a short distance away, it was quiet. Many men were in their bunks when suddenly an unbelievable explosion occurred shortly after 10:18 p.m. Survivors in Oakland and San Francisco still remember the explosion from 20 and 35 miles away. People in the nearby rural communities continue to remember this explosion the way survivors of the earthquake in San Francisco did many years after. The E.A. Bryan was loaded that night with 4,600 tons of ammunition and high explosives. Bombs weighing 650 pounds each with their activating mechanisms or fuses fully installed were being loaded one at a time. The dock and the ship had disappeared after the explosion. The E.A. Bryan was eviscerated. The very few pieces were found of this large ship. The Quinault Victory was lifted clear out of the water in an instant by the blast, turned over and broken into pieces with very little of it remaining. The 1,200-foot-long wooden pier simply disappeared. This is the day after the explosion, and this is what was left of the pier. During the evening, the accounts talk about people in the barracks being completely in black because all the electricity went out, not knowing what had happened, not knowing what had happened to their colleagues down at the pier. Many of them thought they were under attack by the Japanese. I have one account from Jack Critton, who was a guard on duty that night. Quote, "The barracks had a lot of windows, lower and upper deck. This is a distance away from this site. Whole sides of windows. They were blown to pieces. Some guys lost their sight. Others were badly cut. Finally, they got the emergency lights together. Then some guys came by in a truck, and we went down to the dock, all on our own. But when we got there, we didn't see no dock, no ship, no nothing, just darkness. Everyone on board the 2 ships and the fire barge were killed instantly. 320 men, 202 whom were African Americans. Another 390 military personnel and civilians were injured, including 233 black enlisted men. This single stunning disaster accounted for more than 15% of all the black naval casualties during World War II. Property damage, military and civilian, was estimated at that time at more than $12 million. Again, Mr. Critton recounted, you would see a shoe with a foot in it. And then you would remember how you joked often with your colleagues about who was going to be the first out of that hole if something went wrong. You'd see a head floating across the water, just the head or an arm, bodies, just awful. 4 Port Chicago seamen and 1 black enlisted man were awarded medals for their heroic conduct in fighting the ammunition boxcar fire and subsequent fires that broke out that evening after the explosion. A proposal was presented to Congress to grant families up to $5,000 in compensation for the loss of their loved ones. However, when Mississippi Representative John Rankin objected to the plan because most of the beneficiaries were black, Congress reduced the maximum allowable grant to $3,000. 4 days after the explosion, a Naval Court of Inquiry convened on Treasure Island, or I should say on Mare Island, to inquire into the circumstances of the explosion. Captain Nelson Gose admitted that a port director had previously warned him, again, quote, "Conditions are bad up there. You've got to do something about it. If you aren't careful, something's going to happen, and you'll be held responsible." The judge advocate of the inquiry concluded by addressing the question of the role of black enlisted personnel in his official inquiry. And I quote, "The consensus of opinion of the witnesses, and practically admitted by the interested parties, is that the colored enlisted personnel are neither temperamentally or intellectually capable of handling high explosives." In short, they blamed the victims because they were African American. During the weeks after and the days after, the men obviously were in a state of shock, troubled by the vivid memory of horrible explosion in which so many of their friends had died and so many of them had believed would come to bear, and then unfortunately saw the tragedy worse than they could imagine. Everybody was scared, one survivor recalled. If someone dropped a box or slammed a door, people began jumping around like crazy. Many of the black survivors expected to be granted survivor's leave, as was custom at that time in the Navy, to visit their families before being reassigned to regular duty. They waited and waited to get these 30 days off, to go visit friends and to start to process what they had seen before they would come back to regular duty, which they were happy to do. Such leaves were not granted. Even men who had been hospitalized were not granted leaves. All men were to be sent back to work loading ammunition under the same officers before. However, white officers were allowed to go home for 30-day leaves, all of them. You can see why, under these circumstances and given the tragedy, many of the enlisted African-American survivors of Port Chicago were upset in the 3 weeks after the explosion. They continued to be treated as they were treated before the explosion, in spite of their warnings, the warnings of the professionals of the Longshoremen Union, and the United States Coast Guard. So some weeks later, the men were sent back to Mare Island, a short distance away from where Port Chicago is across the strait, where munition ships were again being loaded for the war effort, an important job. As the men marched to go back to work 3 weeks after the incident, they still did not know where they were going as they marched. They did not know that but they did know that at a certain juncture in the road, they could be ordered to turn right, which would take them to the parade ground, or they could be ordered to turn left, which would take them to the ferry that crossed the river to the ammunition loading dock, where they would inevitably resume doing the same work they had done before. There was a young enlisted officer, or enlisted man, who had natural leadership qualities from New Jersey, who we'll hear about shortly. Enlisted man Small, he actually directed the cadence as they walked back. And he described what happened next as he delivered the cadence and he marched his division back towards the pier. I was marching on the left-hand side of the ranks when the lieutenant gave the command, column left. Everybody stopped, dead, boom, just like that. He said, the captain said, forward march, column left. Nobody moved. An officer asked Small, are you going to go back to work? He answered, no, sir. The officer asked why, and he said, I'm afraid. Seen as a leader among the men, others refused to work when he refused to go back. Someone over in the ranks said, if Small don't go, we're not going either. 328 followed enlisted member Small and refused to return to work at that moment. 258 were imprisoned as a result, and shortly thereafter, 50 were charged with conspiring to make mutiny. The trial commenced on Treasure Island shortly thereafter. If these 50 were convicted of the charge, the men faced prison terms of 15 years or death. Mutiny was defined by the defense as an unlawful opposition or resistance to or defiance of superior military authority with a deliberate purpose to usurp, subvert, or override the same. Mutiny was defined by the prosecution as collective insubordination, collective disobedience of lawful orders of a superior, a conspiracy to disobey lawful orders of a superior is mutiny, as opposed to what we described. One sailor stated that we didn't know you could define disobeying orders as being a mutiny. We thought mutiny could only happen on a ship. A refusal to work is a passive act of resistance without intent to seize power. A mutiny, on the other hand, is an act of revolt with intent of taking charge. At this point, I would like to recognize a colleague from the Black Caucus for what time he needs to express himself.
Thank you, Mr. DeSaulnier. May I inquire from the chair how much time we have remaining?
Gentleman has 35 minutes remaining.
Oh, thank you. First, I'd like to thank Congressman DeSaulnier for bringing this important issue up and highlighting, one, the contribution made by these sailors, two, the challenges they faced during this ordeal, and three, the remarkable sense of patriotism that each one of them exhibited and their desire to serve our country. And not often do we bring up things that happened 71 years ago, especially things that have not gained a lot of media attention. But the sacrifice of every man and woman in this country whether black or white or otherwise, deserves recognition. So I am honored to be a part of this hour tonight, and I feel really privileged that I get a chance to talk about a few of my constituents, families that really exemplified what's best in America and what's best about the American people. So the first sailor I will start with is Ernest Joseph Gaines. He was a native of New Orleans. He enlisted in the Navy in 1942 when he was only 20 years old. Before enlisting, he worked as a helper with the doing sheet metal work in a machine shop. At Port Chicago, he was a winch operator and worked loading the E.A. Bryan, one of the ships that was destroyed in the explosion at the base. At the mutiny trial, Gaines testified that he had a lot of trouble controlling the winch he was operating. After the explosion, he said he became afraid of loading ammunition because he knew he could not control the winch. And just as a side note here, there was a report of trouble with the brake on the #1 winch on the E.A. Bryan before the explosion, but whether it was fixed is not known to us. The next person I'd like to talk about is Martin Bordenave from New Orleans. And just think about his eagerness to be and show his patriotism. He initially volunteered for the Navy in 1942 when he was 16 years old. He wanted to follow in the footsteps of his 4 older brothers, all of whom had enlisted in the Navy. When they discovered he was underage, they immediately discharged him, but he immediately re-enlisted in 1944 when he was of proper age. In the meantime, Bordenave worked as a painter, helping his father, who had a job painting houses. And the ultimate thing was with Bordenave, although his patriotism is remarkable, he was one of the African-American soldiers that was injured in the explosion and hospitalized. The last two, one of which is Miller Matthews. He was born and raised in New Orleans, had 5 years of elementary education before becoming a shoeshine boy, then a bus boy, and then a delivery boy, but finally becoming a longshoreman and loading and unloading Mississippi River boats for 6 years. He enlisted in the Navy in 1943 at the age of 27. And then we have Lloyd McKinney, who was born and raised in Donaldsonville, Louisiana, which is another part of my district, where he completed 1 year of high school and then went on to work as a porter in a hotel and later as a helper in an auto repair shop. He enlisted at the age of 18 in 1942. McKinney, in the explosion, suffered lacerations from flying glass in the explosion. But imagine this. He declined to be taken to the hospital because he did not want to take up space that other officers would need because they were more seriously injured. So again, I would like to thank my colleague for really bringing up this story, which I am not ashamed to say is a story that was new to me. And I think that every day we learn more and more about our country, about the people who sacrificed to make this country great, and talking about past instances of discrimination and unfair treatment that African Americans went through, especially while serving their country, only makes this country better. It helps us share perspective and gives us the real-life experiences what others went through, which makes this country stronger, which makes this country better, and it breeds understanding and the love that makes us exceptional. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back to my colleague and thank him again for letting me participate in this special order.
Thank you, Mr. Richmond. I'd like to yield, Mr. Speaker, if it's appropriate this time, to my friend from New Jersey, Representative Coleman.
Thank you very much. I thank the gentleman for yielding to me. And I rise today to join his call for justice for the sailors and the families who suffered in the discriminatory and callous response to Port Chicago Naval Magazine tragedy. This is of particular importance to me because I had the honor of representing the district that the alleged leader of that protest, Joseph Randolph Small, Randolph Small, had called home. But it's also important because of where we are in the arc of history. The events of the past several months have forced our nation to do quite a bit of soul-searching on the topic of race and the enduring injustices felt by men and women of color. From the seemingly inexplicable use of force against unnamed people of color in cases like those of Walter Scott in South Carolina and Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio, to the explicit and disturbing hate crime committed at Mother Emanuel, we know that the bias and the discrimination that occurred at Port Chicago is not isolated to the past. But if there is any positive outcome to these tragedies, it is in the opportunity to heal long buried but never bandaged wounds. Recognizing one such wound, South Carolina recently voted to remove the Confederate battle flag from the grounds of its State House, exonerating the sailors who were unfairly punished simply for seeking safer working conditions would help heal yet another. As my colleague already described, in 1944, a segregated U.S. Navy used black enlisted men with no training to do the heavy, dangerous work of loading ammunition onto vessels that would transport them to the front. That lack of training and neglect for the safety of those sailors led to the greatest home front disaster of World War II and claimed several hundred lives, most of them black. Small, who hailed from the beautiful Somerset, New Jersey, led the protest because the survivors understood that to return to the same routine would mean risking another explosion. That simple protest for basic rights and consideration led to convictions of mutiny, prison sentences, and dishonorably discharges for the sailors who stood with Small. Before the explosion, Small had complained to the new commander that he was promoting inherently dangerous behavior by rewarding the sailors who could load the most ammunition in the shortest period of time. Small was ignored, and after joining his peers in protest, he was kept in solitary confinement during his trial and sentenced to 15 years simply for seeking justice. Exonerating these men would make right a long-standing injustice, and I'm proud to stand with my colleague in this call for action. I thank the gentleman for his work, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady, and I'd like to now yield to the representative from Ohio.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Congressman DeSaulnier and Congresswoman Lee for their leadership and drawing attention to this issue and for helping to bring attention to this really a story of injustice. The story of the Port Chicago 50 isn't in most textbooks or histories of World War II, but perhaps it should be. While it may not be this nation's proudest moment, it is a part of our history, and it's a tragic event which we can learn and we can actually grow, I think, as a nation. The enlisted men stationed at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine, including the Port Chicago 50, served our nation proudly, and they served her honorably. For that, they deserve our gratitude. For those unfamiliar with the story, and I know it's already been talked about, but I'd like to talk about it very briefly again. Following a catastrophic cargo vessel explosion on July 17, 1944, which killed or wounded 710 people, several enlisted men voiced concerns about continuing to handle munitions at the port. Among those voicing concerns were two gentlemen from Cincinnati, Ohio, from the area that I am proud to serve, Mentor Burns and Edward Lee Longmire. Both men enlisted in 1943. They were not lifelong soldiers with extensive training. They were ordinary, patriotic Americans doing their part to help in the war effort. Mr. Burns was a wood turner in a furniture factory before enlisting. Mr. Longmire worked as a sales clerk selling poultry. Nothing in their background prepared them for handling munitions, and unfortunately, the Navy at that time did not provide adequate training for the men serving at Port Chicago. So it's understandable that the men who survived the explosion were reluctant to continue loading munitions without efforts to make the process safer. For that, they were charged with mutiny. Reluctance and even refusal to return to unsafe conditions and procedures is not mutiny, it's common sense. Mr. Speaker, America is the greatest country on the face of the globe, But that doesn't mean we don't at times make mistakes, and that's what happened here. Injustices like the mutiny convictions for the Port Chicago 50, they certainly fall within that category. However, one of the things that makes America great is the freedom of the American people and the people's elected representatives to speak out against injustices, correct past wrongs, and strive for a better future for all of us. We can't go back in time and prevent the convictions of the Port Chicago 50, but we can correct the record. And we can exonerate those wrongfully convicted and give their families and their loved ones the peace of knowing that they served our nation honorably and faithfully, that they did nothing wrong. Mr. Speaker, it's far past time that the Port Chicago 50 receive justice. We owe it to Mr. Burns, Mr. Longmire, and the rest of those wrongfully convicted and discharged. We need to set the record straight, and I want to thank my colleagues for making it possible for us this evening to participate in this effort, and I yield back.
And I want to thank the gentleman for his eloquence and to the point of what we asked for today. And with that, I'd like to yield to my neighbor and my colleague and my partner in this effort, Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much for yielding. And first, let me just start by thanking my colleague and my neighbor in the East Bay, Congressman DeSaulnier, for organizing this very important and long overdue special order. Since being elected to the House, Congressman DeSaulnier, you have really been doing a phenomenal job working on behalf of your constituents on a whole range of issues as a member of course, the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. And so I know your constituents are thanking you, but I just want to thank you for coming and hitting the ground running on so many issues, including our efforts to eliminate poverty. Also tonight is so important, the special order calling for the exoneration of these brave and courageous men. This is an issue, I must say, that I have worked on for many, many years, first as a staffer to my mentor and predecessor, Congressman Ron Dellums, and then alongside your predecessor, Congressman George Miller, who was a true leader on so many issues. Some, and you may have mentioned this earlier, may know that in 1999 we pulled together a national petition and persuaded President Clinton to pardon one of the few surviving convicted sailors affected by this tragedy. We also worked tirelessly to preserve the Port Chicago National Memorial through legislation, the Port Chicago Naval Magazine Memorial Enhancement Act, which President Obama signed into law in 2009. So I'm very pleased to see that we're here tonight once again calling for justice for the African-American sailors at Port Chicago. This story needs to be told over and over and over again as we are doing tonight. And once again, thank you for taking that baton and continuing to fight the good fight for justice, Congressman DeSaulnier. As we stand here just days before the 71st anniversary of a national tragedy that is far too often forgotten, we remember the 320 American soldiers, African-American soldiers were, I think, 200 of the 320, who lost their lives in the deadliest home front disaster of World War II. But we also remember how deeply this tragedy was marked by, yes, institutional racism and the solemn duty we have to undo the legacy of that racism today, which Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman talked about very eloquently. The Port Chicago Naval Magazine, as some may know, is located near Concord, California, right next to my congressional district. On the evening of July 17, 1944, a violent explosion ripped through the magazine, shattering piers, destroying vital ships, and blowing out windows as far away as San Francisco. As I said earlier, all in all, 320 sailors lost their lives. 200 of them were African Americans. The cause of this tragedy was inadequate training and insufficient safety precautions around handling active munitions. All of the enlisted men who were unloading the active munitions onto a cargo vessel at the time of the explosion were African American. Our nation's then segregated military barred African American enlisted servicemen from active naval duty and therefore from receiving the proper training to handle artillery. Nevertheless, white officers at Port Chicago ordered African American sailors to improperly load active munitions into ships, resulting in the tragic explosion. These men died serving their country on the home front and died because their lives and personal safety were not valued by their commanding officers. But the story does not end there. 3 weeks after the tragedy, the more than 300 African American sailors who survived the tragedy were once again ordered to continue loading ships in the same perilous fashion. Nearly all of them stood their ground and refused to return to work without proper safety conditions and ammunition training in place. All of those who refused to go back to work in unsafe conditions were arrested. 208 of them were sentenced to bad conduct discharges and forfeiture of 3 months' pay for disobeying orders. This is mind-boggling as I recount the history of this tonight. It's so sad. But 50 of these men who stood up for their rights and spoke truth to power about the value of their lives were charged with mutiny. Mutiny, mind you. Convicted and sentenced to hard labor and dishonorably discharged from the Navy. They are now known as the Port Chicago 50. And so we're here tonight demanding justice for their courage and recognition for their service. Instead of being cited for mutiny and dishonor, these men should be recognized for standing up to the specter of discrimination and racism in the armed forces. And as the daughter of a retired lieutenant colonel in the Army, I remember these days very, very vividly as a child. So these naval sailors, these men, show that their courageous act of defiance really is part of the long history of people of color demanding just basic respect for their rights and that their lives, which continues to this day. That's why it's so important for us to stand here tonight and remember their brave actions and how they pushed us towards progress in our nation and the armed forces. But to date, only one of the Port Chicago 50 has been pardoned, only one. For the remaining 49, their families have been patiently waiting for their names to be cleared of this unjust conviction. So I urge my colleagues to join us in calling for the exoneration of these 49 sailors. These brave sailors should be remembered for their courage. They were heroes. They are heroes. They stood up in the face of discrimination and the devaluing of black lives. So we must continue to tell this story, which is far too often left out of our narratives on civil rights, military history, and yes, California history and the history of our nation. As Dr. King said, and Congressman DeSaulnier, I'm reminded of this tonight because you are certainly showing us that Dr. King's quote, "The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice." This is one night that you're helping to bend that arc towards justice. And so thank you again, Congressman DeSaulnier, for your leadership in ensuring that not only we remember those who were lost in this tragedy, but that we move forward and exonerate each and every one of them. Thank you again.